Hello all, welcome to the show. I'm Gus Gagliardi and this is Fire Code Tech. On Fire Code Tech, we interview fire protection professionals from all different careers and backgrounds in order to provide insight and a resource for those in the field. My goal is to help you become a more informed fire protection professional. Fire Code Tech has interviews with engineers and researchers, fire marshals, and insurance professionals, and highlights topics like codes and standards, engineering systems, professional development, and trending topics in the industry. So if you're someone who wants to know more about fire protection or the fascinating stories of those who are in the field, you're in the right place. Hello all, welcome to episode 63 of Fire Code Tech. On this episode, we're speaking with Jeff Moore. Jeff is a fire protection engineer with over 40 years in the fire and life safety industry. Jeff breaks down some of the roles that he's had over his career in consulting in engineering, insurance, and all aspects of fire and life safety. I connected with Jeff through social media because I saw that he had generated a couple of books on fire and life safety. We get into the wise old fire protection engineer and industrial fire control concepts. During the conversation, we talk about some of the fundamentals of fire and life safety, like understanding historic fires and really diving into the gray areas of fire and life safety where you need a fire protection engineer or a certified professional to really provide value and context for building owners and other professionals. Thank you all for listening. Hope you enjoyed the episode. And don't forget to subscribe and give us a follow on social media. Let's get into it. Well, Jeff, welcome to Fire Code Tech. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Oh yeah, glad to have you here. I just would like to start off in a very similar fashion to a lot of the podcast interviews and ask about your background and how you found your way into fire and life safety.
Well, probably like a lot of fire protection engineers and people in the fire protection field, started off in the fire service. I grew up in a firehouse. My dad was a fire officer. My grandfather was a fire chief. Uncle was a fire chief. Brother, cousins, firefighters. Essentially, if you wanted to see your family, you had to join the fire department. So uh, I did that, and that was the beginning of my interest in fire protection, and it's never waned. So,
Well, very cool. Well, so um, did you where did you get your formal education for becoming a fire protection engineer? That's cool to hear about that you had such a rich environment in the home and family life to, people to lean on that knew about the industry.
yeah, well, then um, when I graduated high school, I started off at Ohio State University in Columbus. I was studying engineering there, and I was continuing my fire service involvement. At that time, I was part of the Columbus Fire Department Auxiliary, and also ran EMS for the Ohio State University Division of Fire Safety. And as things progressed along and I got closer to graduation, I was looking for a way to combine the interest in the fire service with the engineering background. And at that time, I think the only graduate program in the country was the University of Maryland. Um, but Factory Mutual and industrial risk insurers, and I think to a lesser extent Kemper Insurance, were hiring engineers from all different backgrounds at that time. And then they had a 1 to 2 year training program they put them through that cross trained them in fire protection engineering so they could send them into industrial facilities and would understand what's going on as well as having the fire protection background. So I talked to all three of those companies, ended up going with industrial risk insurers. I took a job in their Cincinnati district office and spent 6 years there, going through as a field engineer and a district supervising engineer, and then went to their training department in Hartford, Connecticut. I was up there for 3 years the first time, and there we developed training programs for the new engineers as well as for customer personnel and other insurance companies and people like that. Spent 3 years developing and teaching those programs. Then kind of got homesick from Hartford, Connecticut. I actually was from Ohio, so ended up moving back to Ohio and took a job at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base as the fire protection engineer there, where I did all kinds of cool stuff. And then IRI came back to me and asked kind of uh, one of the first work from home type people, I guess. They asked me if I could do the same thing I did before, but just do it from my house. Would I be interested? And I jumped at that chance. So I went back and was in the training department for um, IRI and spent another 11, 12 years there developing programs and training people. And it was a very, very good background. Got into a lot of types, different industrial environments and things like that. Then in 2001, I took a job at with Hughes Associates and was a senior fire protection engineer for them, and later a director. Spent about 18 years with them. The last couple then were with after Jensen and Hughes combined to form Jensen Hughes, and left them in 2019, and have done just independent consulting and fire protection engineering work for a bunch of different firms and several federal agencies since then. So that's kind of where I come from. Mostly it's an industrial background, industrial and military. The Air Force experience familiarized me with the military requirements. So I spend a lot of time working on military projects of all different types. Uh, so that's kind of where I've been in my career so far.
Very awesome. Well, it seems like the training and education piece has been a through line, and we'll get to the books and some of that, like learning and promotion of education, a little bit later on in the podcast. But has that always been a through line in your career, that teaching, or how did you get into that sort of thing?
Well, it probably started when I was with IRI. When I started in Cincinnati, I was with the suburban Cincinnati Fire Department for a number of years, and served as a fire instructor, an EMS instructor, and a training officer. And that was kind of the pathway into the training department at IRI as well. I also did field training for IRI engineers when I was in Cincinnati. So that was kind of the path that got me into the training, and I always have always been interested in that. Always liked doing training, still do. Um, and So yeah, it's been a thread through my whole career. Later on, got into training, doing training for NFPA as an SFPE and several other organizations as well.
Awesome. So you gave mention to a lot of different aviation and Department of Defense work. But just for my personal interest, how does the insurance piece of the kind of the services you offer now, like what do those look like in comparison? Because I have an engineering consulting background, so
hmm
I'm fairly familiar with that, but not so familiar with like how consulting of just like risk assessment and that insurance more bent to the services kind of plays out. I don't know if you could speak to that broadly.
Yeah, for a long time, I think probably the two biggest suppliers of fire protection engineers in the country were industrial risk insurers, or IRI, and Factory Mutual, because their engineers were going through industrial facilities that they insured on a regular basis, usually at least once a year. A lot of the larger, more complex ones twice a year, and each survey was at that point in time, and I think it's changed a lot now. I don't think they're going to the depth that they were, but at that point in time, it was a deep dive into every facility you went into. and you really closely examined everything. And really, what it was just a fire risk assessment um, of the facility and the hazards to gather information, both for the client. I mean, you obviously the client got benefit out of what you learned from the surveys, but the real reason was to gather the information that the companies needed to profitably underwrite the insurance. Um, the HPR, highly protected risk insurance field, is different than typical homeowner insurance or something because most of that is done. It's underwritten statistically. If you insure 500,000 homes through an insurance company, then statistically from the past that each year probably uh, a certain percentage of them, 1,000 of them are going to burn down, and 300 of them are going to get blown away by tornadoes, and 400 are going to get blown away by hurricanes, and you've got this historical statistical base that you can use to determine, okay, based on the value that I'm insuring, how much do I have to charge for insurance in order to make a profit, to make sure I'm making a profit at the end of the year. Well, for industrial facilities, it doesn't really work that way. If you count up, for example, automotive assembly plants, there's probably less than 400 or 500 of those in the entire world. So you don't have a big base of statistical information on which you can base insurance rates. So it's done generally on a facility by facility basis of going in and looking and seeing what's there, evaluating the hazards, the construction, the protection uh, against established standards, many of which were the NFPA standards or the insurance company standards, which often built on top of those NFPA standards, so that you could set an insurance rate, and hopefully at the end of the year they made money.
Wow, yeah, that's very interesting. And it kind of resonates with me a little bit because the firm I work for has um, a decent specialty in aircraft hangars. And, with all the shakeup on film incident reporting and the data from that, and just the kind of high risk but not big enough data pool to draw trends and frequencies of fire events. And so I can see what you're saying by the insurance pieces, the confluence of risk analysis for high hazard facilities where that you just don't have the incident history and data to support, a probabilistic insurance rate. But that's interesting to hear you talk about.
You talk about the aircraft hangars. I know when I worked for the Air Force, I was on a team that we were looking at revising aircraft hangar fire protection at that time. And so one of the things we did was we went back in the DoD database, and we were only able to go back 10 or 11 years because that's all they had computerized at that point. But look for every kind of fire incident that had occurred in a Department of Defense uh, aircraft hangar over that period. And what we found was they're very, very. We designed most aircraft hangar fire protection systems in the past for the big fuel dump on the floor and ignition. Um, and what we found is that really never happened. um, I think in all the events we could find, there was one place where there's a fuel spill on the floor that ignited, and that was actually controlled and contained by an old World War II vintage deluge water spray system. And all the other fires in hangars were all related to ground support equipment, electrical equipment out in the hangar, but it wasn't really a hangar fire. So there just wasn't, like you say, there weren't the fires that we were designing for at that time. They just weren't occurring. It was just such a low incidence of occurrence that I think that started to look at what are we really doing here?
Yeah, it's been quite a shakeup in federal and non-federal, with first the fluorine in the foam and the PFAS and PFOA and eliminating those, and then also the DoD coming through with the sundown policies and kind of moving away towards away from foam. So it's
Right.
interesting. I've just been seeing the entire industry just moving away from that technology, which I have mixed feelings about. But I understand that you can't argue with if you have a system that at the end of the day, accomplishes all your life safety goals that as a community we consensus around and say that's acceptable.
And a lot of it comes down to the risk management aspects of it versus fire protection because um, when I worked for the Air Force, I mean, in the commercial world, the 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 concern is generally protection of the building. You look at a large commercial aircraft hangar, and there's millions and millions and millions of dollars involved in that. And if they have an incident, shuts it down, then that affects maintenance and required maintenance, and has a cascading effect down the line that could cost them many, many more millions of dollars. In the Air Force, um, generally the concern was that the buildings were, you know, not that expensive compared to the aircraft we were storing inside. If you look at a B-1 aircraft, which at that time I think was going for close to $1 billion per copy, um, that was the concern, not the building.
Right.
So in some cases, it was the efforts were directed at protecting the aircraft, not the building, which is kind of flipped from what 409 and you know the insurance companies had a lot of input on the original development and evolution of NFPA 409 because they generally property insurers insured the building. Somebody else insured the airframe, that was inside it. So that's why
Interesting.
409 tended to be directed more toward protection of the building.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point to bring up. And I mean, I definitely didn't know before doing working in the with commercial airlines and DoD to see, oh, the whole building might be worth um, $200 million, but you're like you were saying, each aircraft in the two bays is worth a billion apiece. So I mean, it's kind of distorted those dollars and risk factors. So good to hear you speak on that. Um, I wanted to ask you about, so you're um, working in consulting services for yourself now, and just for the listeners, those who might not be as aware of what kind some of these services are that you list on your site, just like general design and engineering and analysis and consulting. But yeah, would you speak to at your company, Firemark, what kind of different professional services that you're involved in?
It kind of runs the gamut of things. It's about any type of fire protection or fire life safety system, sprinklers, fire alarm detection, water supplies, special extinguishing systems. Again, worked in all different types of facilities uh, for development of those types of designs. I've also, with the insurance background, done a lot of fire risk assessment of various types of facilities and hazards, and um, I've even looked at evaluation of the overall fire protection programs for some campus type facilities. And when I say campus, not necessarily colleges, but like larger military installations and larger industrial facilities that make up, multiple buildings on the same site. Um, in one case, I did a complete analysis for a military reservation where they were looking at what kind of fire response they really needed. A lot of it was remote, and could they do it themselves? Should they contract with various fire departments around them? That type of thing. So, uh, really, any of those types of things in just about any type of industry. I mean, uh, started out with the insurance industry. A lot of the automotive companies we insured. So I was very familiar with all the different automotive facilities, including assembly plants, aircraft hangars. I've done work in congressional office buildings, air traffic control facilities, a lot of different heavy industries, chemical industries. Um, the Air Force at Wright-Patterson is the center for um, their research and development of all their aircraft and everything. So there's a lot of high tech research facilities there. Done some NASA work, um, and been in just about every type of military facility you can think of.
Yeah, very nice. Cool. Cool to hear about. Well, Jeff, I'd like to break into your time writing and producing the two pieces of literature that I reached out to you initially to talk about for this interview. The first one being the new 51 Conversations with the Wise Old Fire Protection Engineer, and then also Industrial Fire Control Concepts. Sorry, I fumbled on that one. But yeah, super interested to hear you speak about, these books and how you got started generating these kind of texts because it's not extremely common in our industry for individuals to produce written content for fire and life safety professionals, in my opinion.
Yeah, sure. If it's all right, I'll start with industrial fire control concepts because that kind of led to the second one. Um, the Industrial Fire Control Concepts book, and I'm just going to call it IFCC for short, so you have to keep repeating that. But when I worked in the training department at IRI, every week we had 20 to 30 people in from different companies, either from within IRI or other member companies of IRI or customer personnel, plant engineers, plant managers, safety supervisors, security personnel, people like that that would come through our training laboratory for we had a 1 week course in industrial fire protection. And when they left, they'd leave with a big notebook full of handouts and articles and drawings and other things that we hoped they'd be able to put the use back in their facilities. And while the participants always seemed to love the course, because there's lots of hands-on in the laboratory and we had a live fire training area and things like that, one of their common complaints was, well, this is all great stuff, but it's like drinking from a fire hose. And why isn't all this stuff in a book someplace? So, one of the other instructors, Larry Davis, and I sat down, and Larry had actually, I think at that point in time, he was on about his third fire service training book that he had published. And we sat down and decided, well, we had to write a textbook for this course. So we sat down and put an outline together and had all the stuff in that we thought they would need for this course, plus for use as a reference when they got back to their facilities. We went to IRI management and presented it to them so we could do this, in IRI's name, and they would have a textbook for the course and uh, you know just improve the quality of the course. And they basically patted us on the head and said, no, no, just go back to work. We don't need anything like that. So we took the idea of the International Society of Fire Service Instructors and presented it to them. They liked the idea, so they said, if you guys write it, we'll publish it, which we did and they did. Um, and so the first edition of the IFCC book came out in late 1988. Um, and IRI actually ended up buying them for all their courses, so they ended up using it anyhow. And they actually changed the name of the course that they're teaching to Industrial Fire Control Concepts. Um, so we did that, and then later in, I guess it was about 2006, NFPA wanted us to update it, and they wanted to republish it. So we updated it, and it was republished by NFPA. And they gave it a different title, though. They called it Facility Manager's Fire Protection Guide, and that was in their stock for a number of years. But when their stock of printed books ran out, um, they decided they weren't going to republish it. So the copyright reverted back to the authors. Unfortunately, by then, Larry Davis had passed from cancer. So it ended up in my lap. And I thought, well, I'll go ahead and update this again. And just the press of business and things kind of kept me from doing that until the pandemic hit. And then suddenly I had plenty of time to work on some of these back burner projects. So I sat down and earnestly during the pandemic trying to update it, and completed that in late 2021, and then it was published in March of this year, 2022. Now, as part of that, one of the things we had was we always had these, and I've used these throughout training and anything that I've done, is trying to get across to people different concepts that I think are important by putting them in context with how they might be used out in the field. Um, and so, one way of doing that is, I don't know if you ever heard of him, but a gentleman by the name of Walter Mabee, Walter W. Mabee, used to be the head of fire protection engineering for the Department of Energy. And he published this little independent newsletter for federal fire protection engineers. And within that newsletter, he would provide little quips and quotes and trivia and things like that through conversations between what he termed the brash young fire protection engineer and the wise old fire protection engineer, kind of the trainer and the trainee. Because Walter had come from the same uh, insurance background that I had. And actually, he came up through IRI when it was called the Factory Insurance Association. So I had these little stories scattered throughout industrial fire control concepts to reinforce and introduce different important uh, fire protection concepts and information. And so after publication of that, I had a couple of people ask, well, where do we find those stories by themselves? And um, they really weren't available. So I went back through and extracted all those, and I had about a half a dozen others that I had not used in the book, but had sitting on the shelf, and added those in and published those stories as the 51 Conversations with the Wise Old Fire Protection Engineer, which became available, I guess, in August of this year.
Wow. Very cool to hear about. Yeah, and just to give people a broad, like, understanding of what kind of topics IFCC covers. It's very it seems like a really good entry into just risk, and it goes as broad as fire science and as specific as different types of engineering systems like sprinkler systems, water supplies, manual fire suppression, special extinguishing systems, pumps. And so I think that, um, yeah, I was showing some of the members at the consulting group I worked with, and they were like, wow, this looks really comprehensive. Is somebody teaching a course off this? I'd be really surprised if they weren't, just because of how the depth of it. I mean, it's uh, nearly over 500 pages long, so it's a pretty hefty book.
Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, it was a course till IRI actually, um, through some other mergers and acquisitions, ended up being acquired by somebody else, and it's not around anymore. So they're not the course that it's based on wasn't taught. But yeah, if you follow that book through, that's essentially the course that we tried to teach in a week. So that's why people thought they were
Wow.
drinking from a fire hose. So
Yeah.
we tried to give everybody, and really what it was for is it's not so much a fire protection engineering course as it is, like I think I mentioned once before, a fire risk management course. Because the original audience for it was for people who had to make fire protection decisions but didn't have formal fire protection training. If you're a plant manager or a plant engineer, you're the one deciding: am I going to put sprinklers in here, or am I not? Or if I am, what kind do I need? What kind of water supply? A lot of times they're at the mercy of a contractor or somebody who doesn't know their facility like they do. So the idea was giving them a framework within which they can make an informed decision. They don't need to know the nitty gritty of uh, pipe wall thickness in a sprinkler system necessarily to make that decision, but they need to know the different types and the decision making process of, do I use wet pipe, dry pipe, pre-action, deluge? Should I have an electric driven fire pump or a diesel engine driven fire pump? Those types of things. It's that decision making. So the information is there on how these systems work, but incorporated in it is the um, background information for how do I make an informed decision when I have to make a selection between two, three, four different things.
Yeah, I appreciate that context that, this is not a guide on the fire protection engineering decision tree. This is, like you said previously, for facilities managers that are going to be confronted with these fire and life safety decisions. So, yeah, I appreciate you kind of like sandwiching that, the exposition about the content.
Yeah, it's really, like I said, about 90% of what we need for a good site specific fire protection program hasn't changed in the past 50 years. Uh, Now, a lot of people ignore it, but the actual information decision making process hasn't really changed that much. So that's what this is really about: is how do I take all the pieces in the fire protection pie and put them together to give me that site specific fire protection and control program that I need for my specific facility. So it's not, you can find all kinds of books out there that are code based, how to comply with the 13 or 72 or NFPA 20. It's not that. It's not a code book. We talk about codes and standards in there and some of the requirements, but it's not a code book. It's not a how to book. It's something to help you put all those pieces together.
And so, you know, I want to ask about who you would recommend for the audience of like the wise old conversations with the wise old fire protection engineer. I have a young man who I've been mentoring a little bit out of school, and he's talking to me about, just trying to grasp all the different topics at hand, and also kind of adapting to all of the different considerations for just getting integrated at a workplace. But yeah, who did you have in mind when you decided to pair out these stories for the from IFCC?
Um, Really, I think what it was is the idea that there's important lessons here that don't necessarily come through in a lot of the traditional texts. Um, a lot of times I've looked at in the past years, and I'm sure you've done the same thing, is that you look at a report and it's written on some particular facility, and all it really is a regurgitation of the code requirements. Now, it may be written in more flowery language and um, more expansive than what the code says, but really it's just an explanation of what the code says. Um, and the idea behind the wise old fire protection engineer stories was to give some of the background behind those types of things. For example, I mean, take what we could do. Take fire detection. Um, if somebody has a fire detection question, they immediately go to NFPA 72, and you can look it up in there in Chapter 18 for initiating devices. There's all the different types of fire detectors and the spacing requirements and how high the ceiling can be for this spacing and what candela rating and you might need for a notification appliance. I guess that's in a different chapter, but all these black and white questions or black and white answers to the common questions people have. But for example, well, how did he decide that this is how a fire detector gets its listed spacing, its UL listed spacing? So that background is often missing. And so that's one of the stories in there, for example, that I put in the IFCC book, and which is now in that 51 Conversations with the Wise Old Fire Protection Engineer, is the history of, well, how did we arrive at um, how these listed spacings are assigned for a heat detector, for example. And when you trace that all the way back, a lot of people think, well, it came down from the mountain up in Quincy, Massachusetts, on a stone tablet as to what has to be. Well, it really didn't. There's an evolution of how we got there, and that background information is, I think, a lot of times important to understanding the overall fire protection requirements for a facility. We get so wrapped up in a lot of cases looking at the individual trees that we oftentimes forget to stand back and take a look at the forest. Well, wait a minute, how does this fit into everything overall? And again, that's what the each one of those little stories is kind of background information on how to make a decision about something. Um, One of them in there that was particularly close to me because it happened to me was one about I walked into a research facility one time, and uh, all the flammable liquids that they had in this research facility throughout the place, they go into each individual lab, they were stored in wooden cabinets. I said, well, that can't be because NFPA 30 says this, da da da. And it was pointed out to me that, wait a minute, each of these cabinets that they're storing it in um, is built to a specification that's actually provided in NFPA 30. So there's nothing in NFPA 30 that says you have to have a metal storage cabinet. It says you have to store them in an approved cabinet of some type, but it gives you the specifications on how to build one out of wood. And that's what they had done. They had a carpenter on staff, and he didn't have a lot to do, so they assigned him to build a bunch of these cabinets for each individual laboratory. And um, they liked them because they looked like fine furniture versus a bland metal cabinet. But that was something that I had never picked up in my years in the field. Um, and so there's a lot of those little stories like that are background information to give you the whole story, to look at the forest and not just the trees.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. That's a great piece of context. I think that, the broad contextual information about why we make the fire and life safety decisions that we make paired with, how fire protection engineers and life safety professionals navigate the gray areas or areas that are a bit of an unknown or not explicitly stated in the code are where individuals bring a lot of value. So I think that's a good point you make about how to not just regurgitate code and try to provide a richer and broader context for how we showing our work and how we got to the decision that we made. So yeah, I think that's a great point, Jeff.
Yeah, you don't need a fire protection engineer to go down through a code or standard with a checklist and say, did they do A, B, C, and D? You need a fire protection engineer to to do the analysis to determine whether I should do A or B or C or D based on my individual site specific needs and conditions.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Well, yeah, I'm gonna throw some links down in the description, and we'll tell people where to find all the links. But yeah, I wanted to move on to a couple of professional development questions that I always like to ask people who have good experience in the industry. But yeah, so it sounds like you've had a network of really good mentors and a wide variety of career experiences. But, how do you keep your finger on the pulse of the industry? What kind of resources do you use to keep informed?
Um, Probably the typical journals that most people see. I'm still involved in NFPA and SFPE in my local chapters and some regional fire protection and fire safety organizations. But a lot of it is just trying to keep up with the it's almost information overload anymore with all the new stuff that's coming out, but just trying to keep familiar with where things are progressing. Um, so just journals and articles, and a lot of that's online now, so it's relatively easy to access. I do try to obtain and read the new books as they come out, um, to see what other viewpoints are out there. But I'd say probably the typical types of things that most people that are looking at fire protection as their career would need to be involved in.
Gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, and so we talked a little bit about, trends in the reduction in HEF and AFFF systems, but I just was wondering what other kind of trends do you see right now in fire and life safety?
Um, I, I think the biggest one is everything seems to be accelerating. Um, Time frames and schedules to complete projects seem to be continually shrinking, and there's a point of diminishing return there where, the old thing about you can have it fast, you can have it good, or you can have it cheap. You got to pick two of them. The idea that, you probably have the same experience I do with people that don't engage a fire protection engineer up front because they think, well, that's going to cost me money. Well, it's probably going to cost you money one way or another, because I get a lot of calls from people that um, should have called 6 months ago, but now they've really got themselves in a jam and they need an answer a week from last Tuesday. Uh, so I think that idea of to trying to do everything on such an accelerated basis with such short time frames, which in some cases I think are just totally unrealistic for providing a good design and a good product for the customer. Um, Being one of the, I'd say, old guys out there, we've kind of talked about this a little bit already. One of the observations I've made is that there seems to be this trend for people to ignore the simple solutions while they are off pursuing some more complicated solution, or to look only at the alternatives that they're familiar with. Um, Again, one of the stories in the Wise Old Fire Protection Engineer book is about the wise old fire protection engineers talking to the brash young fire protection engineer about hammer salesmen. And he says, well, what does that have to do with, fire detection? And the wise old fire protection engineer says, well, it doesn't, have anything to do with fire detection. It's just that, if the only thing you're familiar with or comfortable with, or the only thing you're selling is fire detection alarm equipment, then you see every problem as a fire detection problem. If you're a sprinkler guy, then your answer to everything is a sprinkler. If you're selling clean agents, then your answer to everything is a clean agent system. And it doesn't really work that way. And a lot of times we go down some rabbit hole trying to make something fit that really doesn't. When again, if we'd stand back and look at the entire forest versus individual trees, we could see how things need to fit in this overall site specific philosophy of providing good fire protection. Um, so that's one of the things I see, and just I guess, not to be pejorative or anything, but ignorance of and ignoring the past lessons. I mean, if you look at what in the past year, how many major warehouses and distribution centers have we burned down across the country? I can just off the top of my head think of probably a half a dozen that have made national news. Well, and we don't have all the details on all those things, but I could almost guarantee you that when they uh, come down with the final reports and we can look at what's actually been happening, that we're not going to learn any new lessons that we didn't already know after the Kmart fire in the 1980s, or the Sherwin-Williams fire, or any of those major warehouse fires, the Ford um, distribution center fire in Europe in the late 70s. Those are all the same types of fires, the same types of things happened, and it had the same result. But people continue to ignore those early lessons, which is a very, very expensive way to learn. And we continue about once a generation to um, learn the same lessons or try to be taught the same lessons over and over. Are you familiar with the General Motors Livonia transmission plant fire?
No, no, I'm not.
It's a fire that occurred up in, how about this, the General Motors Livonia transmission plant. I think it was like 1953. This is one of the case studies that's in the IFCC book. Um, but they burned a 34-acre industrial automotive facility completely to the ground. And at that point, people thought, well, that shouldn't be able to happen. Um, well, they did a deep dive into that and came up with what the causes were. And this, when metal deck roofs became an issue, combustible metal deck roofs, because that was a major contributing factor. And General Motors and the automotive industry in general, as well as other industries that were watching them, learned a great deal from that fire because it almost put General Motors out of business. Um, well, I remember talking to somebody in General Motors fire protection at one time at a conference, and we just happened to be in an elevator, and I knew him from my IRI days. And I asked him, I said, what's your biggest fire protection problem right now? And his answer was, nobody remembers Livonia, meaning that whole generation that worked with the struggle after the Livonia fire to keep everything afloat was gone from General Motors. So they didn't have that firsthand knowledge of what was going on during and after that fire. And so those lessons are kind of lost on the next generation because they never had to experience that. And we see that over and over. Like I said, with the warehousing, it's happening right now. We're burning these huge warehouses to the ground, and there'll be all kinds of technical data and everything. But what it's going to boil down to is that we're not protecting the warehouses based on what we're storing and how we're storing it. We can protect about everything, but we tend to ignore the lessons that we've learned, and owners not knowing any better in a lot of cases are not appreciative of the very significant impact what seems to be to them a very insignificant change might make, increasing the height of storage by 2 feet. Well, we know from fire testing that can burn the warehouse down. By staging loads for shipping in the aisle between the racks. We know from warehouse fire testing and past experience that can burn the warehouse to the ground. And I think we're probably going to find out the same things in these most recent fires as what we've had in the early ones. And people just continue to ignore and fail to learn from the past lessons that we paid for very, very dearly over the past few years.
Wow, yeah, that's a great point. Our profession is built on these historic fires, and so it's a real shame to not remember, um, these events that cost life and property and millions and millions of dollars. So that's a great
Absolutely.
point, Jeff. That's how they start off teaching, um, basically the craft of how to be a fire and life safety professional is looking back. So, man,
Yeah.
yeah, I found that touching.
Yeah, I don't know what if they still do it or not. Factory Mutual used to publish these little flyers um, about significant fires, and I think they called them, what has happened can happen. Meaning, hey, look at what's happened. Look what we've paid for in the past. Don't let this happen at your facility. But in the press of time and everything else, a lot of that is still ignored today.
Man, well, I think that is a very poetic way to end the conversation. But I'd like to ask you where people can go to find out information, where to buy the book, where to get information about you. Yeah, and do you it give you a chance to plug your different books and resources?
Okay. Appreciate that. Both books, Industrial Fire Control Concepts and 51 Conversations with the Wise Old Fire Protection Engineer, available on Amazon in both hard copy and electronically in Kindle format. Both books are also available electronically in Apple Books format on the iTunes Store. Uh, Both places you can get samples of it, but they're kind of limited the way Amazon and Apple set it up. But if anybody wants a more robust sample, they can simply email industrial fire control concepts at gmail.com. It's just the name of the book, at gmail.com. And they can get about a 50-page sample of the IFCC book, which shows how it's laid out and what it looks like. Because again, one of the things that's a little bit different than a lot of similar kinds of books is it's heavily illustrated with photos and drawings, and I mean every page basically has one or more graphics of some type. Um, because of that, I will tell you that the electronic platforms aren't really set up to handle the intensive graphics as well as a hard copy publication is. Um, all the same information is there, all the same graphics and everything. It just doesn't look as nice on the electronic version as it does in the hard copy. But that's where they're all available.
Yeah, and I will, second on that conversation about the graphics. The graphics are really good, and in fire and life safety, oftentimes it's easy to provide text, but hard to provide nice cut sections of equipment and diagrams. And so that is one really nice thing about IFCC is it has a lot of these visual representations of these technical topics. So just wanted to piggyback off that.
Thank you.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you, Jeff, so much for coming on the podcast. And yeah, that was great.
Well, I appreciate it, and I enjoyed it a lot. So hopefully we'll talk again sometime.
Definitely. Thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to share the episode with a friend if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that fire protection and life safety is serious business. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are by no means a professional consultation or a codes and standards interpretation. Be sure to contact a licensed professional if you are getting involved with fire protection and or life safety. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.